don't think, well, would they really put this on the air? Like, you don't need to worry about that. You don't need to be the network censor. There are people who get paid to do that. Your job is to impress the reader. Don't worry about if it's going to get shot or made. It's not. That's not what the job of your script is. The job is to just make the reader's eyes open. That's it.
You're listening to Screenwriters Need to Hear This with Michael Jamin.
Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Jamin. You're listening to Screenwriters Need to Hear This. I'm here with Phil Hudson. Hey Phil.
What's up?
What's up? And today, well, we're just going to dive right into it, people. We don't mess around here. Today we're going to talk about something that people seem to overlook a lot. They don't think hard enough about when they write their screenplays. And this applies to whether you're writing a teleplay, a movie, whatever. So the episode today is called Let's Talk About Page 1 of Your Script. Phil, that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about page 1.
I love that because this is the hardest part for most people.
It's the hardest part, and you don't understand how crucial it is. I think there's, at least when my partner, you've sold a couple of movies, and I remember the very first time the first movie we wrote, I had this image in my mind that, we gave it to our feature agent, and then it all leads up to a big release. I mean, they really put a lot of work into this. We were working, it was like he was strategizing how it was going to be released, and he was building a lot of expectation for it. And he's like, this is the day, guys. It's Friday. We're going to send it out for the weekend read. This is the day. Cross your fingers. We'll know by Monday. And so it's really he really hyped it up. In my mind, I guess I thought it was, I guess it was such an important event for me and my partner and my agent that I assumed it was going to be an important event for everyone else reading it. And it just doesn't work that way. So what happens is executives, everyone, and this applies to TV and film, they have something called the weekend read, whereas they've been working all week and they're doing whatever their meetings and projects, whatever the hell they have to do. And on the weekend, you think they get some time to relax, but they don't. This is when they actually have to prepare for next week. And they'll take home, these executives take home like stacks of scripts that they have to get through. And oh my God, it just seems like a nightmare. I don't know, who knows how many they have to read, but it could easily be a dozen. I wouldn't be surprised at all. And so if you're one in that stack of a dozen, they're not, in my mind, they were going to be they're taking my script and they were going to, sit by the fireplace and open a bottle of wine, really just, enjoy the hell out of it. But in reality, these people have lives. They don't want to do this on the weekend. They've already worked all week. They want to be with their kids. They want to go out to dinner. They want to do whatever they want to do on the weekends. And the last thing I imagine they'd want to do is more work. Even though it's kind of fun work, it's still work. And so all of us, screenwriters, we spend a lot of time, we spend months writing this script, right? And every comma is perfect. There's no typos. There's nothing. And we all have this expectation that these people are going to give it the respect that it deserves. It just doesn't work that way. So the reality is they have so much to do, and you can understand that why they might be a little lazy about it, because they have to get through this whole stack of scripts and they really want to do other things, and you can't blame them. And so even if they have the best intentions, they are going to be on the third script. They're going to be like, wait a minute, which character is this? Oh yeah. Which story am I following? Who's who? Oh, that was the last script. Even if they have the best intentions. So my partner, our strategy was always to come out and really smack them in the mouth on page 1 with something really like a big joke, really hard joke, something that would make, even if it was over the top, because something edgy and something unexpected, because to me it was like, wake up, stupid. I need you to wake up because this is my career. Wake up because you are falling asleep at the wheel, and I don't blame you, but I have to wake you up because this is important to me. And so it was always about what can we do on page 1 that can smack them in the mouth, and not wait to page 30, because at that point, they're already lost interest. They're not thinking about it the way you expect them to think about it,
Yeah. So a couple thoughts come to my mind there as you're laying that out. So you answer the question what the weekend read is, and you talk about your agent preparing for this big release.
Yeah.
When you mean release, in my mind, I'm thinking they're putting it out to the trades, they're doing that, but that's not really what's going on, right? Is they're just distributing it to the executives
Yes.
that they have
The wide,
contacts with, who are
right.
willing to read things. They submit them because your agent's built that relationship of trust that they're only going to send them quality projects.
Right.
And then they're still going home. And it's, any work, no matter how fun it is in the beginning, will eventually become a little monotonous at a point,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I do this because I love TV. 30 years down the line, you're an executive making those decisions. I'm sure some people are looking for that, but some people are just burnout. Like, it's just...
I got to be honest, even when I'm working on a TV show and my job is to read scripts from like new writers that are on staff on our show, it can get boring for me. If it's not done well, it can get boring. And I think often then like, well, imagine I complain about reading a half-hour script. Imagine what it must be like for our lawyer having to dread through like heavy, really text-heavy stuff, and it's not meant to be entertaining. The stuff that I read is meant to be entertaining, but sometimes, actually often, it's not. And man, it's just bad when you have to read something that's supposed to be entertaining. Like a legal document, it's not going to be fun. But with something like a script, there's the expectation that this is going to be fun. And it's, in many ways, I think it might be even more disappointing if it's not, because it's like, then it really feels like homework,
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple other things that came up for me while you were going through that. I've heard you reference many times in our conversations and just, private chats we've had about this, but also talking to other people on social media. You talk about how, and let me just back that up. And I probably mentioned this in the podcast before, so I apologize. We might get a little redundant with this, but I think this is still worth talking about because so many people have these questions where you're into this podcast now. Some people are going to hop right into this because it's specific to this topic. The very first spec script I wrote was a spec Workaholics. And I remember I sent that to you and I got that feedback. This feels a little Frankenstein to me. And I was like, oh, this is just heartbreaking. I've just burned this bridge with this guy who's reading my script. But you gave me this piece of advice. You said, start with the funniest thing you can think of. Don't save that for the end because they may never get there. You want to start with it. And I was like, immediately in my gut, I'm like, but if it's the funniest thing I can think of, how do I make it funnier?
You got to think of something else.
And that's what is your point. It forces you to be better than that, right?
Yeah.
And so it seems like you're giving that same advice is instead of saving it for Act 3, put it on page 1. What is the thing that you can start with? What's that thing that you call punching him in the mouth? Is that advice accurate? Like, am I
yeah, no, that's exact. I remember that. And it's also, another thing is you want to start the story sooner. Whatever you think that you'll get this note all the time. I don't know what this, but you'll get this note all the time from an executive. Start the story sooner. And maybe you don't even know what that means. And we talk about this in the course, what exactly that means, how to start a story sooner. But you can never start it soon enough because, people are not as interested as you think they are in what you're writing. They're just not. Sorry. And so you got to start it sooner, and you got to, in comedy, it's a little different, but you want, like when you want to smack them in the face with a joke, but often, you'll see this as well. On an action movie, they'll, like on a James Bond movie, they always start with him jumping out of an airplane and doing something crazy. It's almost frivolous. It's almost unnecessary.
Yeah.
But it's like, man, you're smacking the viewer right in the face. And then when that sequence is over, then James Bond gets called in for his first mission. But it's the same kind of thinking. It's like, wake up, everyone.
Yeah, we're thrown into the world of media. It's like GoldenEye, which was my favorite James Bond growing up as a kid because I was just the right age. It's literally him running up, jumping off of a dam, and rappelling down into a secret base to steal stuff, right? Super cool. Got you.
Right.
I've been listening to the Terminal List podcast, Terminal List by Jack Carr. It's a big action series on Amazon. I don't know if you've paid much attention to that. But that's one of the things that is an adaptation of a really popular book series Jack Carr wrote. He's former Navy SEAL, but they talk about how they break their stories and they think about it. In each episode, they do a deep dive. And the showrunner's on there. And one of the things they talked about was that opening scene where you're like, literally, it starts with them like getting an op and they're in a cave that's flooded and they're being pinned down, and it is just nothing but action. And it's funny because I was watching it with my 96-year-old grandmother-in-law over Thanksgiving break, and she got so bored with about 3 minutes in, just like, it's nothing but shooting. Meanwhile, I'm on the edge of my seat, like super into it.
Or it wasn't for her.
Right. Not for her, right? So you got to start with the genre and what the intent of the audience is, right? That was for me, not for her.
But I also as you know, like I love the writing of David Sedaris, and I was watching a masterclass that he did, and he basically said the same thing when he writes his stories, his essays, is that he read several different versions of one story, the beginning of one story. He was never happy with the way it began. He didn't feel like it just grabbed you enough. And I was like, wow, I like all three of these. But he, it's just something we all have to worry. Like if you're worried about your reader or your audience, and you should be, or else they're not, or else they're going to get up and leave. It's something you need to consider. And it's not just the first line; it's the first page. It's the first scene. It's the first sequence. Like you better, because in today's world, everyone's competing for your eyes.
Yeah, and attention span's going down. The last data I saw was 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. You could see a brand 17 times. You can see an advertisement for a brand 17 times before you even recognized it as a brand. And
it used to be 7.
It was 14 the year before that, right? So, and I have to imagine that's in the 20s now. So there's just so much stuff out there, people trying to take your attention that they're actively doing. I mean, look at the way trailers are done now. They don't start with enter and tell the story. It's like a bam, bam, explosion, action sequence for like 5 seconds. Put up some factors or some reasons you should pay attention to this, and then it jumps into the normal trailer we would have seen back in the 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah.
They're competing too.
Yeah. So, that's just, it may feel like a bummer to people, but the sooner you accept this, the more likely you're going to do well,
Yeah. So you talked about comedy, right? In comedy, you said smack him in the mouth is a good joke, like a big joke.
Yeah.
I know we talk a little bit about this in your course, but what about, like, what's advice you have and a way to consider that joke? Like, what's a good way to come up with that joke? And I understand that's a very nuanced question, right? Because it could be situational, it could be a moment, character, interpersonal things. How do you conceptualize that when you're writing a pilot with your writing partner?
It's hard to say. Like often, we've done a number of them where it's kind of a sex joke. It's over the line. You're just going up the line, maybe even crossing it, which is okay in a spec. You're not shooting this thing, so especially for comedy, you're going to be read by comedy writers, so we don't get offended easily. So you can I feel you can cross the line as long as it's funny. You probably wouldn't shoot it. You probably wouldn't put it on the air. But in terms of making me wake up, that'll do it.
Yeah, good. Got it. Okay. So push the limits, right?
Yeah.
What if you're concerned about misrepresenting yourself or the type of stuff that you write, right? Like, so let's take someone who has a conservative background and they are afraid to put that type of blue joke out there, but they're trying to write for a blue script.
Yeah, I mean, but even shows that are like, let's say any of those Tim Allen shows that skew conservative, the writing staff is for sure mixed. If anything, it might lean towards left. And it's like, that's why we don't even. It's so silly when people think I'm putting my political agendas or writers. We're writing the agenda of what the character is, and it's like, so I'll make a joke that might lean towards conservative. I certainly made many jokes like that on King of the Hill. I mean, Hank was very conservative. Like, it doesn't. I'm speaking for the character, not for myself. So, if you feel like you're conservative and you don't want to write jokes that make fun of conservatives, well, you're neglecting what your job is. Your job is to service the characters, not your political leanings.
Hey, it's Michael Jamin. If you like my videos and you want me to email them to you for free, join my watch list. Every Friday, I send out my top 3 videos. These are for writers, actors, creative types. You can unsubscribe whenever you want. I'm not going to spam you, and it's absolutely free. Just go to michaeljamin.com/watchlist.
Right. And we brought that up before. Stephen King on Writing says it's your job is to channel the character. You are not the character. And if you censor them, you are doing a disservice.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. For character, do you consider, I have to imagine that you're displaying some form of character, like you're putting character on the page and you're informing us about that character with what's happening in this type of interaction. How much character are you trying to reveal on the first page? Or are you just trying to help us understand? Like, are you doing any world building in that page? or is it really just putting us in a situation where we are going to make it, where it's something that's going to make the reader pay attention because it catches them off guard, it's funny,
Yeah.
it's action.
I'm not really, that whole world building thing is like, how interesting is that to watch? It might be interesting to create, but is it interesting to watch? So I always feel like the character, you have this character, and the character kind of informs the story, and the story informs the character. And so it's like, what's going on at this moment? And I'm less interested in painting the world of the other characters as so much as I'm like, let's just hook the reader for a second.
Got it. But it is being guided by this character and the world they're in. And so that helps your joke.
And that's kind of part of the problem. That's often why people say like the pilot episode is usually the worst episode out of the first 10 or whatever, because you do have to build this world. I understand that. And often you'll get tons of notes from executives who want you to do just that. It's very frustrating. It seems like they want you to preemptively answer every question that the audience could possibly ask, which is nuts to me. But that's just how that puts them at ease, at least in the comedy world.
This isn't necessarily the topic of this conversation, but for writers who are being told now to write pilots rather than specs as a writing sample, we're doing a lot of world building. I just had a conversation with one of the PAs on Tacoma FD yesterday. We had about an hour drive back from dropping off a truck we were using. And that was our conversation. He's like, I'd be happy to just write and be a staff writer. I don't care to be the guy who's building or selling, a pilot and being a showrunner. If that happens, awesome. But I just want to be a writer. And here I am trying to do all this world building.
Yeah, I agree with him. He's smart.
Yeah. But there's always been that conversation of the premise pilot versus just a pilot, right? And it feels like in the world of today where we have to build a pilot, they're all kind of premise pilots, right? We're establishing the world and why we're entering this world and who these characters are rather than just throwing them into a scene in this ordinary world.
Not really, because a premise pilot that's kind of a different discussion. That might be, I think I talked about this a couple days ago. It was like, let's say your pilot is about a guy, a guy who works in Silicon Valley, one of these tech startup guys, and he's got a multi-billionaire and he's living the life and he's got the ladies and he's working crazy hours and drinking Red Bull. You've seen this before. And then he loses all his money. Like the company goes belly up. He can't get a job at another company because he's such a jerk. Everyone hates him. And so he's forced to go to do the one thing he swore he never would do, which is go back home and live with mom and dad. Okay, so if this were a premise pilot, you'd have all that stuff would happen, and then the final scene, the final shot of the pilot would be ding dong, hi mom, hi dad. Mm-hmm. And now he has to live in this world and interact with the characters, the girl he went to high school with, and the bully who used to beat him up. And that's the show, right? The show is him living in the farm or whatever, the Silicon Valley guy living on the farm or whatever, the small town or whatever. So that would be a premise pilot. But the problem with that is the premise pilot is completely different from the other 99 episodes of this show, because you're living with all these characters, the tech world characters. But now in episode 2, you're on the farm or in the small town and living with those characters. And so it almost feels like you have two very different shows. And so often the note you'll get from it, some studios or networks don't want premise pilots for that reason. It feels like, well, this is not the show. And they're right, it isn't the show. Some don't care. So what you'll get is a note which would be, instead of the last beat of the show, instead of that being ding dong, hi mom and dad, that might be the first act break. Ding dong, hi mom, dad, I'm home. Or it might even be the middle of act 1. You might have to move it up even faster. So that's not a premise pilot.
Got it. So I've totally misunderstood what a premise pilot is for the last decade, because my understanding is and I've always this doesn't make sense, because if a premise pilot is putting us in the situation we're going into, isn't that every episode of every television show? Yeah. But what you're saying is, no, just move it forward and make it part of the show. So this is our character. They fall into this situation just like they would any other episode. And again, you do a really good job of breaking down what these story beats are and where these things fall and how to make them happen. By the way, totally not prescriptive the way most people would think about structure. Just very clear understanding of these little tent poles that need to happen in order for us to carry us through this, and we can pepper in all the stuff in between. So that's hugely helpful to me, and I'm assuming it's going to be helpful to other people listening to this episode, because like, dang, I've totally had that wrong for a long time. It's been a point of frustration for me.
Yeah,
So
because you're right. I mean, every pilot is you set up the premise, but when they say premise pilot, that's kind of what they mean.
got it. Okay, awesome. So on that first page, this is something I thought was really interesting, and I guess I questioned this for a while.
Mhm.
There's this great article by Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio on their website Word Player, which I talk about all the time, but it's a great resource. It's been around for forever. The AOL message boards back in the late 90s and early 2000s, but it's their archives of that stuff. And one of the things they talk about, they wrote Pirates of the Caribbean and Shrek and Aladdin and all those other films that most people my generation grew up with. But they talk about point of view. And I never thought about this until I read this article, but they take Pirates of the Caribbean. Like, who's the protagonist of Pirates of the Caribbean? I think most people might say, well, it's Jack or it's Will, right? But their point is, no, it's who do we open with? And they open with Elizabeth Swann on the boat, and she's really the protagonist of the whole story. These other characters are just characters populating that world that she's in. How much do you think about that? Like, do you always start with your protagonist because you give that advice, we're here to see the star? Or
Right.
do you start with, and you don't write a lot of genre, like the bad guy? Can we start with their point of view to kind of set up this intrigue to then move us into that world? That's something I've thought of a lot too.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can make that decision for yourself, but the truth of the matter is, if you got a big star and you want to get him or her onto screen as soon as possible, generally, because that's where that's the magic, that's the star. That doesn't mean, it doesn't necessarily mean they're even the most interesting character. I remember one of the things about Die Hard, like Hans, what was his name?
Hans Gruber.
Hans Gruber was like,
best Christmas movie, and then fight me anybody if you don't think it's a Christmas movie.
And he was like this great small character, and yet he kind of stole the show. The character is so fascinating, and so it's not like this. The hero is necessarily the most fascinating character. Often the villains are,
but we still
interesting.
Start with him on the plane, right? John.
Yeah, I mean, I think you want to know whose story we're following. Okay. That doesn't mean you can't have a cold open setting up a crime, and then that the first scene is all that the crime happens, and the next scene we're at the detective's office, and he's trying to figure out, okay, here's my assignment of the day. That's fine.
Got it. No Country for Old Men, right? It starts with this scene where the bad guy's being arrested, and then he's in jail, and then he strangles the cop, and then he steals the car, and then he kind of goes on this rampage. But it's not about him, right? It's about Josh Brolin's character. So that's another example of that really interesting bad guy, but equally interesting protagonist.
It's really hard. I know this is not what we're planning on talking about, but it's really hard to have a psychopath as your main character, because that character is so off the wall. You want to root for this person, and that guy was a murderer and a psychopath. It's not that it can't be done.
Dexter did it.
Dexter did it, right?
But he had moral values that were embedded in him by his father, and that moral compass that Jiminy Cricket is there being his conscience throughout the whole episode.
So you have to, but the truth is, you have to humanize that character. You have to move him slowly towards the center.
People, he kills bad guys, so we're okay with it. Right.
And so he wasn't really, when you think about Dexter, really wasn't a psychopath. He's Batman. He's Batman, right? Right. He's a vigilante.
So the reason I ask this is because, that page 1, are we starting with that character? Is that a requirement? The pilot that we reviewed on this script, which is available, is episode 33, the one that I wrote, it doesn't start with our protagonist. It starts with the bad guy, but it's like it's 7/8 of a page, and then we jump into the bad guy.
But then still on page 1, you want to make that page 1 super interesting, and you want to make that, if you have a crime that's going to happen on the first 2 pages, you got to make it really interesting and not by the book, so that people are still grabbed by this. So, if it's something we've seen before 100 times, that crime, no one's going to make it to page 2 when we finally meet the detective or whoever is supposed to fight the crime. You got to grab them on page 1.
Right. How much, and I imagine this is just the nature of how we write as writers, but how much of the writer's point of view or their voice do you need to see in that page? And I think that's coming from two ways, two things. One, I'm a writer trying to get people to read this thing to get it made. And two, you're a showrunner reading a script. How much are you looking at a writer's capacity and voice on that first page?
So that's so hard because it's like, if you're being hired as a staff writer on an existing show, we don't care. You don't need a voice. We need you to capture the voice of the show. You need to be a mimic. And so that's why it's so unfair that you have to write these spec scripts to get a job. It's just, that's how it is. But if you were to write an original movie or original pilot, then your voice is really important. And two things, like, there are two shows I think really do this very well. The Great, which is the Catherine the Great show, like that has such a unique voice on that show. The same thing with White Lotus. It's such a unique voice. It's not written the way. It's not written the way I think other, I don't know, less idiosyncratic writers would write that show. It's so unique. I find the voice of it, and so that's wonderful. And that tone is so interesting. Catherine, the Great show is very heightened. It's very like, it's almost theatrical, and it's almost like I don't buy any of it except all the characters in this world live in that heightenedness. And so it's like, okay, in that world, everyone's just a little bit bananas. And then because of that, you can kind of believe it. I mean, you can believe it, even though in reality, that's not how they would have acted because they're just not that, people aren't that nuts. But that's why I think that show is so brilliantly written. Same thing with White Lotus. Mike White is so specific with the way he writes scenes. It's I think that's what makes it stand out. But the problem is that just takes years and years of practice and training, and yet the new writer is supposed to be able to do this right out of the gate. It just seems so unfair.
Yeah,
go ahead. Well, and the reason why it's not intended to be unfair. It's just because the market is so, everything's so spread out that there's no one hit show anymore. It's not like there's 4 networks and a couple dozen shows. There's a billion platforms, so no one's watching the same show. It's so unusual for there to be a show that everyone's watching, maybe like White Lotus or Stranger Things or something.
Wednesday's the new thing that everyone's watching.
Wednesday, right?
On Netflix, right?
And so. That's what makes it hard for new writers. I feel like it's just the way it is now.
That was the bulk of that conversation I had with that PA. He's a very talented writer. I've read some of his stuff, and I would say he's pretty close to at least the caliber that I am, or the skill set that I have. But his biggest frustration, he's like, I'm doing this thing that I will never do again, other than, I get the opportunity to sell something. So, as far as page 1 goes, just kind of summarize what we've been talking about. You have to make it stand out. It needs to be super interesting. Starting with your protagonist is helpful because we get an idea of who they are and they're going to inform that situation. But the biggest thing is grab attention to get them to keep reading, to keep turning the page.
Yeah. And sometimes people say, you got to hook them. But no one knows what that means, really. And I feel like I do know what that means. When people say you got to hook them, I think people are always thinking of a gimmick. How do I trick people? What's the hook? What's the gimmick, right? But to me, the hook means, how do I hook people into the story? And that means starting the story quick enough. And we talk about this in the course. Once the story starts, we are hooked. That's just it. You don't need to trick me. We're hooked. So
yeah,
that's what hook means to me.
And you give that, when you talk about story, you talk about the 3 elements of story, which we've talked about on the podcast before, but you have that first lesson from your course available for free to everyone, and it does talk about those 3 elements. Yeah. And so, those 3 elements, which I won't spoil because I think it's worth going through the presentation that you give in that free lesson, michaeljamin.com/free for anyone who's interested in that. Yeah. Incredibly, incredibly important stuff. And you phrase it in a way too that they weren't even capable of phrasing it in film school. And these are like WGA writers who are teaching some of these classes. And they asked that question, and I gave them your definition, and they literally put it into their lesson plans because they just had refined that thought. Yeah,
it's easy to understand that way.
So those 3 elements, when the story starts, is it one of those elements, 2, 3 of those elements, or is it, what do you consider that to be from that?
It's all 3 of those elements. The audience has to identify consciously or subconsciously those 3 things, and you'll get it in the free lesson. But it's all those 3 things. And And then and it was just the same thing. I was reading, my daughter, she's in college and she's writing, taking creative writing classes. She goes, "What do you think of this?" And she gave me this piece, and I really enjoyed it. But I go, "It's starting too late. It's starting on page 4. You got to start it earlier." And she understood exactly what I meant. And then she showed me the next draft. Like, "Oh, this is much better." And it's the same. It's very similar. It's just, but the story's moved up earlier. Now I'm hooked.
Yeah. So that goes back to the thing you said basically at the top of the podcast, right? Which is start it sooner, get to it faster, and the way you get to it is story.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. I think that's incredibly powerful and important feedback or advice to people. Yeah. I learned a ton in today's episode.
Good.
Thanks.
I learned something too. I learned how to love.
Well, great. Any other thoughts or feedback on first page? Things you one thing I think that would be super helpful, not to interrupt your thought, for you, is there anything specific you're looking for on that first page? Like, is there anything that, or do you have an example of something that really stood out to you at some point when you were reading a script?
It's not like, I don't want you to think that it should be offensive and it should be distasteful. You want to find this is hard. Find what the line is, go right up to it. But don't pull any punches. I guess that's what I'm saying is like, don't think, well, would they really put this on the air? Like, you don't need to worry about that. You don't need to be the network censor. There are people who get paid to do that. Your job is to impress the reader. Don't worry about if it's going to get shot or made. It's not. That's not what the job of your script is. The job is to just make the reader's eyes open. That's it. They could always pull it back.
Yeah, great. Anything else?
That's it. What else what are we plugging, Phil? What are we promoting?
Yeah, obviously the watch list growing leaps and bounds. I think people are really like that. 3 important lessons for the week, video content that you put out there. It's just sent to your inbox every Friday. You can sign up at michaeljamin.com/watchlist. We've talked about the free lesson, michaeljamin.com/free. Your Paper Orchestra show, which I got to see recently. Powerful. Really moving stuff. And, something that really did make me think about the way that I engage with my family based on one of the stories you told that was obviously very personal to you. And I don't want to spoil that for anyone who ever gets the opportunity to experience that live. Very beautiful. My wife loved it, and she's not one for theater. So that's high praise from
That is high praise. I'll be touring with that. So if anyone wants to find out what city I'm going to be in, they go to michaeljamin.com/upcoming.
I think that's great. And then obviously you have the course that we talk about all the time. And for me, more beautiful feedback coming in every single day, basically into the support email about what they're learning and how they're improving things. I mean, we had someone who signed up for the course said that because of the course, they are probably getting, and I hate celebrating probablys, but he was very ecstatic that his conversations about being a PA on another show that he loves is more likely to happen because of the way he was able to talk about things because of the course. So
it's interesting, because it's not cheap, and I still get people writing me after they buy it, after they go through it, thanking me, which is so nice. It's like they're paying for it. For it. It's not cheap, but I do think we give them their money's worth and then some, I think,
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. The course I wish I had, absolutely recommend it to every single person who's listening. michaeljamin.com/course to learn more about that. Yeah. Michael, thanks again. Wonderful episode with lots of really powerful insights. I think it reminds me of some of the earlier episodes we did that were like really deep in the process, which for me is always fun conversation. So thank you.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Stay tuned next week. We'll be dropping more episodes. All right. Be well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been an episode of Screenwriters Need to Hear This with Michael Jamin. If you'd like to support this podcast, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, and sharing this podcast with someone who needs to hear today's subject. For free daily screenwriting tips, follow Michael on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Michael Jamin Writer. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Phil A. Hudson. This episode was produced by Phil Hudson and edited by Dallas Crane. Until next time, keep writing.